At Lowe's, before the holidays is the perfect time for upgrades and upkeep. During Black Friday, get up to 50% off select major appliances and buy more to save more with up to an additional 25% off when you bundle select major appliances. Plus, grab select DeWalt 20-volt max drill or impact driver kits for just $99. Lowe's. We help, you save. Valid through 12/3. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. See Lowe's.com for more details.
And welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Those of you who've been kind of paying attention to the various kind of pronouncements on threatened and planned invasions, military actions, and other kind of hostilities in the world in 2025. These are kind of announcements from the Trump regime. We'll probably be well aware that there have been various kind of wacky plans to seize Greenland, to seize the Panama Canal. There have been the imposition of tariffs mainly on allied powers, allies of the United States of America. And there have been interventions in support of Israel. There has been a kind of almost a blank check written for Russia and Ukraine. But the standout aggression of the Trump regime in 2025 has been towards the sovereign nation of Venezuela. Venezuela is one of those countries, rather like Cuba, that sits in the crosshairs of American policymaking, whether or not it is a Republican or a Democrat or a Trumpist regime. And the reason for that is that Venezuela is a nation that exists within America's Monroe Doctrine sphere of influence that has refused really to cooperate with the kind of the American-led order in Central and South America. In fact, it's done quite the opposite since the government of Hugo Chavez and now that of Nicolas Maduro. The stats that were revealed a while back, and I think I'll try to put a link to this podcast or blog post that I did by Jason Hickalm on the effect of sanctions since the 1970s, were that I think something in the order of 35 to 40 million people had died as a result of them. Venezuela is one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world, so much so that when the US government decided to sanction Venezuela, Britain seized the gold held by Venezuela in the Bank of England. So that gives you a sense of the kind of the economic siege that Venezuela is under. When various kind of right-wing talking heads on the internet say, well, we don't want socialism, do you? Your country will end up like Venezuela, and they point to hyperinflation and shortages. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, this is what happens when you get socialism. America will enact a kind of a medieval siege against you. Well, point well made. I am facetious, obviously. The United States of America has waged an ongoing economic warfare and political warfare against Venezuela. Now, this we all know. I mean, this is kind of easily Googleable. But what I wanted to do today was to dive into looking at Venezuela in 1945, the kind of country that it was. Venezuela didn't participate in the Second World War, but it emerged from the world that had been shaped by the Second World War. And we're looking at Keith Lowe's book, The Fear and the Freedom. Keith Lowe is such an excellent historian. One of the things that I'm most amazed by is that he doesn't get more press. He's not sort of kind of one of popular public history's biggest names. So if you're listening, Keith, I love your work. It's really, really great. So Keith Lowe writes about Venezuela. He writes, there are moments in many of our lives when, reaching a fork in the road, we realise too late that we have stumbled upon a kind of crisis, that the difference between one path and another is so great that whatever decision we make will necessarily transform both us and those around us permanently. For Carlos Delgado Chalbaud, one such moment arrived in the autumn of 1945. The decisions he made and the fate that befell him are emblematic of the processes that were taking place all over Latin America in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Delgado was an officer and a teacher in the Venezuelan army. Since 1943, he'd been the head of studies at the military academy in Caracas. He was very well read, loved classical music, and spoke several languages, including perfect English and French, but his true area of expertise was military engineering, which he taught with a passion. On the whole, he was well liked by his fellow officers, who regarded him as sober, honest, down-to-earth, conservative, in short, a safe pair of hands, but he was also an outsider. Unlike his colleagues, Delgado had grown up in exile in France after his father had tried to depose Venezuela's military dictator earlier in the century. From the age of 4, he'd only ever really known Venezuela as a concept, a lost home. He had not been able to return permanently until just after the Second World War, when the atmosphere in the country had first shown signs of change. Delgado's dilemma was thrust upon him one day in September 1945. He was approached by a friend who took him aside and told him quite solemnly that a large group of army officers were planning a coup d'etat. Venezuela at that time was ruled by the last in a line of military dictator General Isaias Medina Angarita, whose autocratic behavior had begun to alienate a population hungry for change. A large and vocal opposition had grown up across the country, led by a new political party, Acción Democrática, and now it seemed that the army too was turning against the dictatorship. The younger officers in particular were angry at the poor conditions they were forced to endure and accused Medina of being out of touch with both them and the needs of the nation. Now, this is by no means scientific, but there are numerous occasions when, if you lose the junior officers, you've got trouble on your hands. The older guard are perhaps less likely to, or the top brass are perhaps less likely to overthrow the regime, but it's the middling tier, the captains and the majors and things like that. But if you lose them, they're young and ambitious enough and tired of poor treatment and, still connected enough to the wider society around them in ways that perhaps, chiefs of the general staff aren't. Their plan was to overthrow him and install a new democratic government, overthrow Medina, and they had already secured the cooperation of AD and wanted Delgado to join the cause. Delgado was immediately taken aback. He told his friend that he was neither mentally nor morally prepared for something of this nature and begged for 48 hours to think about it. He gave his word as a gentleman that he would keep quiet about what he'd been told. Over the next 2 days, he grappled with the pros and the cons of joining the conspiracy. Politically, he was inclined to support it, and like most of his fellow countrymen, he'd grown up with the principles of democracy, which he regarded as the only legitimate political system. However, he was not entirely convinced that the best route to democracy was via a military coup. Besides, he knew better than most what would happen if the plan was thwarted. His life in exile had begun because of a failed coup d'etat by his father, and at the age of 20, he himself had sailed across the Atlantic with his father to try again. The attempt had ended in disaster. His father had been killed, and Delgado had only narrowly escaped with his life. These memories must have weighed heavily on him during this period of contemplation. To repeat the endeavour was certainly not a decision to have been taken lightly. Nevertheless, there was an ambitious side to Delgado that could not let an opportunity like this pass. It was plain that the conspiracy was well organised, and that it was likely to enjoy massive popular support. To be at the heart of momentous events, to belong at last to a tight-knit group, to have the chance of success where his father had failed, all of these factors must have played a part in his eventual decision. Because when the coup took place just a few weeks later, Carlos Delgado Chalbaud was one of its leaders. Keithler writes, the insurrection that took place on the 18th of October 1945 owed a great deal to Delgado. It was he who first set it in motion, he who personally arrested the Minister of War and seized control of the military academy in Caracas. He also sent word to the provinces and informed the leader of Acción Democrática, Romulo Betancourt, that the revolution was underway. Over the course of the next 24 hours, his co-conspirators managed to seize the presidential palace, as well as various ports and barracks in the other parts of Venezuela. Naval rebels took control of Puerto Cabello, and the rebels in the Air Force seized the main air base at Maracay. None of this was achieved without spilling blood. Estimates of the dead ranged from several hundred to 2,500. Medina, meanwhile, took refuge in one of the military barracks that remained loyal to him at Ambrosia Plaza. But once it was clear that he was surrounded, outnumbered, and about to be strafed by the Air Force, the dictator surrendered. On the 19th of October, less than 36 hours after the coup started, it came to a successful close. That evening, Delgado and the other rebel leaders gathered in the presidential palace to form the new revolutionary government junta.
At Lowe's, before the holidays is the perfect time for upgrades and upkeep. During Black Friday, get up to 50% off select major appliances and buy more to save more with up to an additional 25% off when you bundle select major appliances. Plus, grab select DeWalt 20-volt max drill or impact driver kits for just $99. Lowe's. We help, you save. Valid through 12/3. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. See Lowe's.com for more details.
In their many discussions over previous weeks, the conspirators had already agreed that this should consist of 7 members, 5 civilian and 2 military. The AD leader, Romulo Betancourt, who had enjoyed enormous popular support, was unanimously accepted as the acting president, along with 3 other AD members, or adicos as they were called, and 1 independent. When it came to choosing the military members, Delgado seized his opportunity. The most popular military candidates, he claimed, were Captain Mario Vargas to represent the more junior officers, and his brother Mario Julio Cesar Vargas to represent some of the more senior. However, since it might be considered nepotistic to have 2 siblings on a junta at the same time, Delgado thought the latter should give away to another senior officer, and he slyly suggested himself as an alternative. his proposal was accepted. The historic moment completed a remarkable journey for Delgado. His agonizing decision, barely a month old, to join a conspiracy against Medina had borne fruit beyond his wildest dreams. Until the coup, he'd been little more than a study master, teaching engineering in the military academy. Now, in the blink of an eye, he'd become the most senior member of the armed forces in the new government. He would spend the next 3 years as the nation's Minister of Defense. So, again, when we look at Venezuela now, the human rights record of the Maduro government comes under close scrutiny. The Nobel Prize winner, most recent, Maria Corina Machado, a kind of darling of Washington think tanks, has, within 24 hours of receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, invited President Donald Trump to bomb her own country. And there is no kind of coincidence in her her sort of winning the prize. People thought that for a moment. I mean, this is actually sort of a fairly clever Trumpian sleight of hand. Trump put himself up for the prize, and there was a kind of a whole slew of liberal opinion getting ready to have a good snicker that ha ha ha, poor deluded Donald Trump can't get the Nobel Peace Prize. But the person who does get the Nobel Peace Prize, Machado, who has been involved in conspiracies against the Venezuelan government, and if you look at it from the kind of neocon kind of color revolution worldview, well, look, is she not a freedom fighter and a passive resistor like Aung San Suu Kyi or something like that? And the reality is, well, no, not really. What she's looking to do is bring about a coup in Venezuela against the Maduro government, which, say what you like about it or think what you like about it, is the current popular government of Venezuela. And the purpose of the coup is to hand oil and mineral rights to American corporations. And you don't have to take my word for it, she's said as much herself. So we look at one act of kind of popular sovereignty, the overthrow of the Medina government in 1945. And then we're looking at a kind of a coup, which arguably is being planned at the moment, which has kind of an entirely different smell to it. A coup which is designed really to benefit nobody other than American corporate interests. Now, General Smedley Butler, I think it was in 1923, I'll check that, wrote a famous book called War is a Racket. And he said basically, I mean, he was eventually kind of interrogated on this at length, but he basically wrote in his very kind of short book, War is a Racket, that he had been in the United States Marine Corps, and on behalf, and he was simply such a mercenary on behalf of the United States government, which in itself was a front for American corporate power to overthrow governments in South and Central America in the interests of things like the United Fruit Company. One needs only to look at the various coups in South America, Allende in Chile, Pinochet's overthrow of Allende in Chile in 1973, to get a kind of a wider historical sense of this. There are almost too, in the 20th century, almost too many American-backed or American-authorized coups to name. I mean, the most recent one would be in Honduras, and again, it's not all Trump. It would be wonderful just to think it was, but it's not. Trump is doing, in a kind of a loud and vulgar and characteristically crass and a kind of overt way the sorts of things that American presidents habitually do. The difference with Trump is that he revels in it, and he revels in impressing his base voters with his bombast. I mean, the fact that American standards of living don't appear particularly to be recovering is, I think, a far more interest to American voters in places like Pittsburgh and Ohio than what's happening in Venezuela. Venezuela is simply presented to American, and not just American, and to the media of the Western world as a bad place. It's an extremely violent country, but the idea that this is somehow the product of a kind of like a popular socialist regime, I think is that's one for the birds, really. Anyway, to continue. Moments of personal ambition like this are perhaps inevitable amongst revolutionaries. To its credit, however, the new junta, Delgado included, did its best to stay true to the spirit of the revolution they had put in place. Their government, they declared, was only a provisional one. Their primary aim was that of convoking the country to general elections so that through the system of direct, universal, and secret suffrage, Venezuelans could elect their representatives, give them a constitution they want, and choose the future president of the republic. To make sure that none of them could abuse their position, they made a strict rule that once the elections had been announced, no one in the junta would be allowed to stand for president. The new Venezuela, democratic Venezuela, must not be tainted by the undemocratic way in which they had seized power. In general, the junta was as good as its word. Less than a month after the coup, it named a commission to draw up a new constitution, but rather than stuffing this commission with adecos or military men, as might have been done in the past, the junta made sure that it represented a range of political opinion, including supporters of the previous regimes. After much debate, this commission granted all citizens the right to vote, women as well as men, the illiterate as well as the literate, and instituted a system of proportional representation. Opposition parties were allowed to form, including communists, Christian Democrats, and even groups associated with General Medina. Just a year after seizing power, the junta held the first in a series of elections which observers from the USA declared were conducted more or less cleanly. This was followed up just a year later by a presidential election. A delight of Venezuela was being treated to its first taste of meaningful democracy. This period would last from 1945 to 1948, a 3-year experience that has been known ever since as the Trienio. It was not only on a national scale that the new junta made revolutionary changes. This also applied to their principles of democracy and freedom of association at a local level. They held municipal elections in May 1948. They also encouraged the formation of a mass organization of the people, such as labor unions and peasant movements. In the 2 years after the October coup, the government officially recognized 740 unions, 240 more than had been allowed in the whole of the previous decade. Furthermore, much like in the rest of the world, the membership of the established unions began to expand massively, sometimes by as much as 500 or 600%. These unions were also allowed to confederate for the first time. By 1948, the newly formed Confederation of Workers of Venezuela boasted about 300,000 members, with perhaps another 50,000 in other unions controlled by the communists. The equally new Peasant Federation of Venezuela had a further 100,000 members. Considering that the populations of Venezuela at the time was just 4.2 million, this represented a huge percentage of the workforce who were actively engaged in public life. So that in itself is really, really interesting. So you get people who, you can get people into trade unions. That's fine, and who are going to benefit from sort of sectional bargaining agreements. But these kinds of unions and federations of unions were about bringing workers into public life, involving workers in not just workplace decisions, but neighborhood, district, regional and national decisions, developing aspects of a workers' democracy. And the idea that a military dictatorship did that is kind of curious, The Trienio government also made revolutionary changes to the economy. Venezuela was a nation built on oil reserves, but those reserves were largely being exploited by British and North American companies. You can see how this is going to end, can't you? During the war, a new series of taxes and rules have been introduced to ensure that the profits of the oil industry would be shared equally between these companies and the nation. This is what gets rid of Mossadegh in 1953, by the way. That very decision, the idea that there's an equitable share of oil wealth between petroleum companies and Iran. As a consequence, the Trienio government was now awash with oil money. In 1947, government income from oil was more than 6 times what it had been before the war. Suddenly, Venezuela was able to embark on many of the grand centralized schemes that other nations were also instituting around this time. In 1946, the government quadrupled its housing budget and then doubled it again the following year. The previous government had already approved a series of housing projects during the war. These were now expanded across the country. A building boom began in Caracas. By the 1950s, the capital had been transformed from a town of traditional red-tiled single-story buildings to a city of modernist high-rises. Alongside the building boom came a boom in learning. The education budget rose from 38 million bolivares in 1945 to 190 million in 1948, with a further 53 million given to the Ministry of Public Works for the construction of dozens of primary and secondary schools. A mass campaign to reduce adult illiteracy was started, and within 3 years, there were 3,600 adult literacy centres across the country. The nation's health budget was also quadrupled. The medical facilities were extended to many rural areas at the first time. According to Romulo Betancourt, the Trienio government spent 3 times as much on sewers and public drinking water supplies as predecessors had spent in the whole of the preceding century. They embarked in a massive campaign to eradicate malaria. Following the success with DDT, which, that's controversial, spraying during the war, spraying with insecticide in Venezuela began in December 1945, eventually eradicating malaria from huge regions of the country. Last but not least, the Army, Navy and Air Force were given new staff, new arms, better training, better food and hygiene, better medical supplies, new libraries and new technical colleges, new ships and shipbuilding institute, 25% more pilots, 100% more specialists, and a complete overhaul of its cultural and recreational facilities. A year into his stint as defense minister, Carlos Delgado Chalbaud was able to talk confidently of a rebirth in the nation's armed forces.
At Lowe's, before the holidays is the perfect time for upgrades and upkeep. During Black Friday, get up to 50% off select major appliances and buy more to save more with up to an additional 25% off when you bundle select major appliances. Plus, grab select DeWalt 20-volt max drill or impact driver kits for just $99. Lowe's. We help, you save. Valid through 12/3. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. See Lowe's.com for more details.
Experience the magic of the holidays at the Bull Run Festival of Lights, Northern Virginia's largest drive-through light show. A family tradition, the Bull Run Festival of Lights is a 2.5-mile drive through sparkling lights, an enchanting addition to your holiday celebrations. Feel the glow of the lights outside and the warmth of the season inside. Save $10 by booking online and save an additional $5 on visits by December 4th with code LIGHTS25. Tickets at bullrunfestivaloflights.com. That's bullrunfestivaloflights.com.
It's easy and tempting to characterize the changes that took place in Venezuela after the October coup in rosy terms. As in other parts of the world, the arrival of democracy was undeniably a triumph for ordinary people of the country. But, as in places, for example, like Indonesia, the pace of reform was so fast and so chaotic that it left those of a more conservative disposition reeling. Businessmen, the Catholic Church, some sections of the military all began to voice worries over social upheavals that were taking place. Of particular concern were the labour unions, whose frequent strikes regularly brought businesses to a standstill. In 1947 alone, there were 55 major strikes, almost 14 times as many as there had been in 1944. Some traditionalists resented the newfound power of the working classes and dismissed the new AD-dominated administration as el gobierno de los alpargatados, excuse me, a government of espadrille-wearing peasants. I want to just kind of take a pause there, because otherwise this episode is going to go on for many, many hours. Just to look at this one dynamic that we see time and time again throughout the second part of the 20th century of mass democracy, mass workers' democracy, and a shift of power away towards the working classes. You see it in Europe, to some extent in New Deal America, and in various parts of the world, in developing nations, places like Venezuela, for example. And the resistance normally comes from the middle classes. There is a belief that not only do the workers have to be kind of knocked back into line, but also that the functioning of society itself is at risk. And it depends from your perspective and from your kind of class perspective what it is you think society is meant to do. For the poor of Venezuela, a new government that builds schools, hospitals, digs drains, eliminates malaria, and lifts people out of poverty, that to them is a kind of an example of a functioning state. But the attitudes towards the working classes and attitudes towards the democratization of the political process, so that working class people not only get a role to play, but also receive a kind of a significant share of the economic and social rewards. This is really nightmarish stuff. This is the kind of thing that leads to, throughout, from 1945 to about 1975 in Great Britain, leads to this enormous kind of middle class backlash against the welfare state and the kind of post-war consensus. It's the kind of thing that was violently suppressed in pre-revolutionary and pre-Civil War Spain. When you read Paul Preston's The Spanish Holocaust, the landlords just dealt with it in one way, and it was lining the peasants up and shooting them. And the run-up to the Civil War is an extraordinarily brutal, violent time where aspects of the state are clearly captured by the landlord class and their various parties on the political right, the landlords and the Catholic Church. So that tension there is a hugely pivotal one, and of course, and in the kind of the context of the Cold War, the threat to American and to some extent British, but mainly American oil revenues, the newly formed CIA and the Truman regime looked very dimly at Venezuela. And I'm going to continue this story and look at what happens, and look at what happens to the newly elected government in a separate podcast. But I just think that it's worth considering when we look at the relentless kind of march towards some sort of conflict over Venezuela, which I think probably will, I'm horrified to say, I think probably will happen now. It's got all the kind of the hallmarks of the build-up to Iraq in 2003, all the same lies and half-truths and propaganda. It's important to consider the long historical tale of the country that we're talking about. And I've just given a tiny postage stamp sized snapshot of it there. that this is and has been a vibrant social democracy, and the population was prepared to defend it then, and I believe will be prepared to defend it now. So let us see how that one plays out. Well, I hope, but Anyway, I'm going to finish there. I did a great interview today, and we'll be posting it in January. We'll be looking at in January the 10th anniversary of the sad death of David Bowie. And so more on that later, but there'll be a special post-Christmas treat for you. Take good care, folks. All the best, and stay safe.
At Capella University, learning online doesn't mean learning alone. You'll get support from people who care about your success, like your enrollment specialist who gets to know you and the goals you'd like to achieve. You'll also get a designated academic coach who's with you throughout your entire program. Plus, career coaches are available to help you navigate your professional goals. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.